crisis theory, concerning the tendency for the rate of profit to fall in a capitalist system, is now generally associated with Marxian economics. Earlier analysis was provided by Jean-Charles Léonard de Sismondi, who provided the first suggestions of its systemic roots. John Stuart Mill in his Of the Tendency of Profits to a Minimum, which forms Chapter 4 of Book IV of his Principles of Political Economy, and Chapter 5, Consequences of the Tendency of Profits to a Minimum, provides a conspectus of the then accepted understanding of a number of the key elements post-Ricardo, but without the theoretical working out that Marx wrote and Engels published subsequently in Capital Volume 3. There are several elements in Marx's presentation which attest to his familiarity with Mill's formulations, notably Mill's treatment of what Marx would subsequently call counteracting tendencies. Destruction of capital through commercial revulsions 5. Improvements in production 6. Importation of cheap necessaries and instruments 7. And emigration of capital 8. Crisis theory was only partially understood among leading Marxists at the beginning of the 20th century. A relatively small group including Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg attempted, not always successfully, theoretically to defend the revolutionary implications of the theory, while others like Edward Bernstein argued against its continued applicability. It was Henrik Grossman who most successfully rescued Marx's theoretical presentation. He was the first Marxist to systematically explore the tendency for the organic composition of capital to rise and hence for the rate of profit to fall as a fundamental feature of Marx's explanation of economic crises in capital. After the 1930s, Joseph Schumpeter's concept of creative destruction attempted to reformulate Marx's analysis in less revolutionary light. In this context, crisis refers to an especially sharp bust cycle of the regular boom and bust pattern of what Marxists term chaotic capitalist development, which, if no countervailing action is taken, develops into a recession or depression. In terms of historical materialism theory, such crises will repeat until objective and subjective factors combine to precipitate the transition to the new mode of production, either by sudden collapse in a final crisis or gradual erosion of the basing on competition and the emerging dominance of cooperation. Causes of crises. Karl Marx considered his crisis theory to be his most substantial theoretical achievement. He presents it in its most developed form as law of tendency for the rate of profit to fall, combined with a discussion of various counter-tendencies, which may slow or modify its impact. Roman Rozdalski observed that Marx concludes by saying that the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is, in every respect, the most important law of modern political economy. Despite its simplicity, it has never before been grasped and even less consciously articulated. It is, from the historical standpoint, the most important law. A key characteristic of these theoretical factors is that none of them are natural or accidental in origin, but instead arise from systemic elements of capitalism as a mode of production and basic social order. In Marx's words, the real barrier of capitalist production is capital itself. In Marx's terms, the economic crises are crises of overproduction and immiseration of the workers who, were it not for the capitalist control of the society, would be the determiners of both demand and production in the first place. These systemic factors include the classical three. Full employment, profit squeezed. Capital accumulation can pull up the demand for labor power, raising wages. If wages rise too high, it hurts the rate of profit, causing a recession. The interaction between the employment rate and the wage share has been mathematically formalized by the Goodwin model. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall, the accumulation of capital, the general advancement of techniques and scale of production, and the inexorable trend to oligopoly by the victors of capitalist market competition, all involve a general tendency for the degree of capital intensity, i.e., the organic composition of capital, of production to rise. All else constant, this is claimed to lead to a fall in the rate of profit, which would slow down accumulation. Overproduction. If the capitalists win, the class struggle to push wages down and labor effort up, raising the rate of surplus value. Then a capitalist economy faces regular problems of excess producer supply and thus inadequate aggregate demand. However, as stated above, all such factors resolve to the synthetic viewpoint that all such crises are crises of over and or misappropriated production relative to the ability and or willingness of the workers who generate the bulk of demand to consume. Application. It is a tenet of many Marxist groupings that crises are inevitable and will be increasingly severe until the contradictions inherent in the mismatch between the mode of production and the development of productive forces reach the final point of failure, determined by the quality of their leadership, the development of the consciousness of the various social classes, and other subjective factors. Thus, according to this theory, the degree of tuning necessary for intervention in otherwise perfect market mechanisms will become more and more extreme as the time in which the capitalist order is a progressive factor in the development of productive forces recedes further and further into the past. But the subjective factors are the explanation for why purely objective factors such as the severity of a crisis, the rate of exploitation, etc., do not alone determine the revolutionary upsurge. A common example is the contrast of the oppression of the working classes in France in centuries prior to 1789, which, although greater, did not lead to social revolution as it did once the complete correlation of forces appeared. Kuruma in his 1929 introduction to the study of crisis ends by noting, "My use of the term theory of crisis is not limited to the theory of economic crisis. This term naturally also encompasses the study of the necessity of imperialist world war as the explosion of the contradictions peculiar to modern capitalism. Imperialist world war itself is precisely crisis in its highest form. Thus, the theory of imperialism must be an extension of the theory of crisis, influence. Crisis theory is central to Marx's writings. It helps underpin Marxist's understanding of a need for systemic change. It is controversial," Roman Rozdulski said. The assertion that Marx did not propose a breakdown theory is primarily attributable to the revisionist interpretation of Marx before and after the First World War. Rosa Luxemburg, Henrik Grossman and Samezo Kuruma both rendered inestimable theoretical services by insisting, as against the revisionists, on the breakdown theory. More recently, David Yaffe 1972, 1978 and Tony Allen al. 1978, 1981 in using the theory to explain the conditions at the end of the post-war boom of the 1970s and 1980s reintroduced the theory to a new generation and gained new readers for Grossman's presentation of Marx's crisis theory. Henrik Grossman's representation of both the central importance of the theory for Marx and the working out of its elements in a partially mathematical form was published in 1929. Central to the argument is the claim that, within a given business cycle, the accumulation of surplus from year to year leads to a kind of top-heaviness, in which a relatively fixed number of workers have to add profit to an ever larger lump of investment capital. This observation leads to what is known as Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Unless certain countervailing possibilities are available, the growth of capital outpaces the growth of labor. So the profits of economic activity have to be shared out more thinly among capitals, i.e., at a lower profit rate. When countervailing tendencies are unavailable or exhausted, the system requires the destruction of capital values in order to return to profitability. Paul Matic's Economic Crisis and Crisis Theory, published by Merlin Press in 1981, is an accessible introduction and discussion derived from Grossman's work. François Chesnace's 1984 chapter Marx's Crisis Theory Today and Christopher Freeman ed. Design, Innovation and Long Cycles in Economic Development Francis Pinter, London, discussed the continuing relevance of the theory. Andrew Kliman has made major new contributions with a thorough and trenchant philosophical and logical defense of the consistency of the theory in Marx's work, against a number of its critics. Difference between Marxists and Keynesians. Keynesian economics, which attempts a middle way between laissez-faire, unadulterated capitalism and state guidance and partial control of economic activity, such as in the French dirigisme or the policies of the Golden Age of capitalism, attempts to address such crises with the policy of having the state actively supplying the deficiencies of unaltered markets. Marxists and Keynesians approach and apply the concept of economic crisis in distinct and opposite ways. The Keynesian approach attempts to stay strictly within the economic sphere and describes boom and bust cycles that balance out. Marxists, on the other hand, see economic crisis as part of the larger crisis of the social order they wish to supplant. There is also a post-Keynesian economics debt crisis theory of Hyman Minsky.